During his recent Oval Office visit with President Donald Trump, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said relations between Israel and her Arab neighbors have never been closer. That's because many Arab countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, now see Iran rather than Israel as the biggest threat to regional security. That's an amazing change in the Middle East. And here to discuss it is Martin Smith. He's international correspondent for Frontline, and he's producer of a new PBS documentary called Bitter Rivals, Iran and Saudi Arabia. Martin, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And you and your team spent about 10 days in Iran, 12 days in Saudi Arabia. You were granted rare interview access for making that film. What were your impressions about both nations and the leaders you interviewed?
Well, they're, as you say in your intro, they're engaged in a deep rivalry, and this dates back to 1979 and the Islamic Revolution in Tehran, when Ayatollah Khomeini came back from exile. He declared that monarchs of the Middle East must be toppled, and he most particularly targeted Saudi Arabia. It was also the case that he was usurping Saudi Arabia's role as leader of the Islamic world, as keeper of the two holiest places in all of Islam, in Mecca and Medina, the mosques of Mecca and Medina. And this was a deep affront to the Saudis and a threat. And ever since that time, and that's what we trace in the series, it's 3 hours on PBS Frontline, and you can see it on the website at pbs.org. The consequences of that rivalry that was sparked in 1979, as it plays out successively in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen. It's a deep and very troubling situation right now.
And I know besides Iran and Saudi Arabia, you also traveled to Syria and other countries. During one recent interview, you recently used the phrase "Gope of Destruction" to describe the current political situation in Syria. So what did you mean by that?
Well, you can't help but be affected by the amount of destruction that you see across Iraq, Syria, Yemen in particularly, but in other places as well. But just whole cities under siege for months at a time, bombs raining down, artillery, rifle fire, mortars, grenades that have just destroyed block after block after block. I mean, people have seen of the scenes in Iraq and in Mosul, but also in Aleppo and Syria. And now, most recently, the bombing campaign that the Saudis have mounted in Yemen that is resulting in thousands of civilian dead and more destruction. So I surveyed this territory over the last year and a half. And I was deeply affected by that, what I saw, and just was really scratching my head as to how this all gets picked up and put back together again. And every expert that I've spoken to says this rivalry is going to get worse before it gets better, I'm sad to say.
You know, with ISIS defeated now, it seems the war in Syria is heating up with various groups, Islamist groups, the government of Syria, Iran, Russia, Turkey. It seems all of them are now jockeying for power and influence there. What do you see happening there?
Well, you know, the neighborhood, as you know, in the Middle East, it's crowded. Lots of borders, lots of countries, and nobody's really minding their own business. So everybody's into everybody else's civil wars. And it has allowed Saudi Arabia and Iran in particular, the two biggest protagonists in the region, to engage in the funding and sponsoring of proxy forces taking up arms against one another. And so that's what you're seeing in Syria. As you say, you've got a number of different sponsors all along throughout the almost 7 years now of war in Syria. You've had the Iranians, you've had Hezbollah sponsored by Iran, you've had Saudi Arabia sponsoring various Salafi conservative Sunni groups, you have Turkey, and the United States, of course, and the Russians from the air, and also various militias from Iraq to Pakistan to Afghanistan. So, you know, there's no chance for Syria to have its own war. Everybody else is in there fighting for a peace.
Yeah, and then we saw Israel's recent direct military response against an Iranian drone that entered into Israel. How
right.
likely is another incident that could perhaps maybe trigger a bigger war between Iran, Israel, and Hezbollah?
Well, I want to think that both Hezbollah, Iran, and Syria and Israel will think twice about having that fight. There's going to be border skirmishes likely. Certainly, Syria would like to push into the Golan Heights. It really depends on the ambitions of, I think, the Iranians as to how far they want to go in pushing Israel. They gain a lot of street cred in some parts of the Middle East by their continuing warfare or war of words or actual warfare with Israel. So there is some incentive there. And it's a fairly, as you know, it's a fairly opaque government at the top, run by clerics in Tehran. It's very hard to know exactly what the clerics and their Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, how far they really want to go.
Martin, do you think the Saudis and other Arab countries would join in against Iran or stay out of it if we end up with a war between Iran and Israel?
Well, I think that the Saudis would use any opportunity they could to push Iran back, but they would have a difficult time coming to the aid of Israel. Politically in the region, it would be a very heavy lift for them to do that. So they might be involved in some kind of clandestine, logistical or intelligence sharing sort of a fashion. But the Saudis aren't a particularly effective military anyway, so hard to know. But certainly they would like to do anything they could to push Iran back.
Okay, Martin Smith, Frontline International Correspondent and PBS documentary producer. We appreciate you. It's a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for sharing your insights today.
Thank you.